Welcome back to Here Lies the Story, to our cemetery series. We're going to be talking today about the Big Four. If you want to read more about this, hereliesthestory.com. I have a long post with all kinds of citations and like rabbit holes to get into about the old cemeteries in San Francisco. But for excuse me, for today, we are going to talk about the Big Four cemeteries, which were the four large private cemeteries that used to be in the western central part of the city. Used to be, right? Because all of our cemeteries are gone. Most of our cemeteries are gone. This was an area that was about 150 acres. It wasn't small, especially for such a small sized city as we are. We are 7 miles by 7 miles, if you don't know that. A small physical area. Lone Mountain Cemetery Complex took up a pretty big chunk of that. When they were established in the 1850s and 1860s, that part of town was known as the outside lands. And it was called outside lands because it's just like what it is, right? It was the edge of town. It was the western half of the city from, where their civilization stopped out to the ocean. There was nothing out there. There was tumbleweeds and I don't know if there was tumbleweeds. There were sand dunes and scrub, and they thought, we're never going to use this part of town. Let's put the cemeteries out there. And of course, as we learned in Yerba Buena Cemetery and with City Cemetery out at Seacliff, that wasn't true. Obviously, the city grew very, very fast, and they needed that land. And so these cemeteries were eventually removed as well. There were four of them. As I mentioned, have I said the Big Four like 16 times? They were called Masonic Cemetery, and the Masons, as you may know, I think they control the world. They're part of the Illuminati, right? I don't know. It's been a while since I watched the Da Vinci Code, but I feel like that's the shorthand internet version of what the Masons are. For real, they are a fraternal organization. And one of the things that they did, they may still do this, I'm not sure, is bury the dead of their members. And so you will see a lot of Masonic cemeteries all over the United States. The Masons have cemeteries everywhere. There was Calvary Cemetery. Calvary Cemetery was the second Catholic cemetery in the city. That was actually where the Target is now on Geary and Masonic. So next time you go to Target, that city Target, it's the only Target with like a good enough parking lot in the city. So you'll probably go there. Oddfellows was the next cemetery. Oddfellows was run by the Independent Order of Oddfellows. You may have heard of them also. They have a lot of cemeteries in the United States. They were also a fraternal society. They were more of a mutual aid society as well. And one of the things they did was take care of the widows and orphans of workers. And as part of that service, they had cemeteries. And so the Oddfellows Cemetery was the third one built. And that was roughly at where Rossi Park is now in San Francisco. That's Arguello and Turk. That's where that was. They still have actually a columbarium. The columbarium is like a mausoleum. It's an indoor space, but it's just for cremated remains. And that is actually still open and active, and you can go check it out. It's really cool. I don't know what the pandemic hours or whatever are, but when this bullshit is over, go check that out. It's really cool. The last one we're going to talk about with the Big Four was Laurel Hill Cemetery. Laurel Hill was the fanciest one. It was roughly where Laurel Village and Laurel Heights are now. So next time you go to, excuse me, next time you have allergies in the middle of COVID, which is exactly what's going on with me right now, I'm like alternate between, am I going to die of COVID and is this just allergies? I don't know, you guys. Just the microphone, I don't know if it's making my throat clearing tics better, but you can let me know in the comments. Laurel Hill was with Laurel Villages. So like I think I began to say, next time you go to get Susie cakes, those cupcakes are fucking delicious. That used to be a cemetery there. Next time you take your kid to the dentist, all the dentists are over there. That was the cemetery. And the entryway, the cemetery gates, were actually located on Bush and Presidio, where the fire museum is now. So maybe some firefighters in here want to tell us about hauntings there. I don't know. Firefighters seem like pretty straightforward group of people, so I'm not sure that they believe in things like this, but that's where the entrance to Laurel Hill Cemetery was. Laurel Hill Cemetery was named after the Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, which was one of the first garden cemeteries in the United States. Garden cemeteries began to develop in the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century, when urban graveyards, which were usually churchyards attached to churches, they began to overflow, right? They were too small to handle the growing cities around them. And if you want to go on like a fun tangent rat hole, go look up the history of Trinity Churchyard, Trinity Graveyard in Manhattan. It's fucking wild. It was a total nuisance. It was like overflowing. Every time there would be an epidemic, like cholera, typhoid, these kind of things would ravage the populations, and the graveyards would just overflow. It's pretty gnarly. I mean, we talked a little bit about that with Yerba Buena, right? Like the conditions were not great. They wanted to move cemeteries. They needed more room in urban areas. And so they would move the cemeteries out to, at the time, what was considered rural areas. So at the time, the outside lands, that was rural. Yeah, I mean, now it's crazy to think about that, but that was the edge of town. So they built the cemetery there, and the intention of the garden cemeteries was to create actually public spaces. So garden cemeteries were our first public parks in the United States. They were intended to be beautiful places that were open to the public and that would be used for more than just burying the dead. You would go there to have a picnic. You would go on walks through there. The kind of things you would do in Golden Gate Park and McLaren Park, you would do at Laurel Hill Cemetery at the time, because that was part of what the garden cemeteries were for. So Laurel Hill started off as a beautiful place, right? A public park, a spot of respite. It was cultivated and nice. And that did not last, unfortunately. So as we talk about all the time on this channel, San Francisco grew really fast. I mean, I think it's pretty incredible to think about how quickly the city exploded. It didn't have hundreds of years to kind of catch up. I mean, this happened in like 50 years. The outside lands became part of San Francisco pretty soon after the cemeteries were established. And that was 150 acres of land that was right in the middle of the city now. And the city wanted it, right? They didn't want it dedicated to the dead. That's a big chunk of land in this small city that we have. And another thing I mention all the time is we're 7 miles by 7 miles. It's small. And there wasn't any room for cemeteries. And so in 1900, the city banned further burials. They said, that's it, no more burials. You got to go to Colma. At this time, Colma was established south of San Francisco. That is our necropolis. That's the word for it. It is a town that's mostly dedicated to the dead. It's mostly cemeteries. And so at this time, Colma was ready to go, and the city was like, that's it, no more burials. And when they did that, they kind of sealed the fate of the cemeteries because no more money was coming in to take care of these places. Back in the day, the way the cemetery operated was all the revenue came from new burials. And when they stopped burying people, there was no money coming in. Nowadays, we have what are called perpetual care funds, which are essentially trust funds. When you buy a plot in a cemetery, part of the money that you pay for the plot goes to the perpetual care of the cemetery, right? In the event that it goes bankrupt or it fills up or for whatever other reason, there will be money to care for it in perpetuity. That wasn't a thing in 1900. So there was no money to take care of these cemeteries, and they fell into disrepair really fast. This is one of my favorite parts of this story, where I get to talk about what the conditions of the cemetery were like. Okay, first of all, 1906, earthquake, right? Breaks a bunch of shit in the cemeteries. Statues topple over, crypts crack, crypts crack. I've tried to say that like 1,000 times in these videos, and I can't figure out the right, it's stone and it falls apart in an earthquake, right? It's in disrepair. It's also inviting people to get into these things, right? If doors are cracking off and things like that, that's a kind of invitation to unsavory folks like tomb robbers to go in there and see what the fuck they can find in there. So as things start to fall apart, weeds grow up, all this stuff, it attracts a certain element of society who wants to come and get up to no good there. Depends on what you define as no good. Some of this shit sounds pretty fun, but the city did not like it and the neighbors did not like it. There is kind of a laundry list of bad activities from the cemeteries. First of all, bootlegging was happening there. We're getting into prohibition, and so people were selling alcohol in the cemeteries. Hooch. There were homeless encampments. There was a lot of vandalism. People were breaking tombs, as I mentioned. They were breaking them for fun, but they were also stealing things off of tombs. There was people having sex in the cemetery. When we talked about dates in the cemetery, right? Well, in the garden cemetery, I guess in the Victorian era, you would take a stroll with your parasol. In the early 20th century, you would go up there to you guys, I'm not good with the euphemisms, and I'm trying to clean up my language. So that shit was happening there. There was also a lot of tomb robbing, as I mentioned. People were breaking into these graves. They were breaking into crypts and vaults and tombs, and they were stealing all kinds of stuff, right? They would steal the brass handles off of caskets because the metal was valuable. They would steal jewelry, I imagine. They're in there hunting around for things like maybe gold teeth. Grave robber shit. The neighbors would talk about hearing noises of like banging and howling at night. And so the banging and howling was a combination of the parties and the tomb robbing, right? It sounds like spooky ghost noises, but actually it's just like people fucking partying in the cemeteries and also stealing shit out of the crypts at night. There was a lot of detritus, I don't know how to say that word, like grave stuff laying around the cemetery. If you can imagine this, pieces of cloth and clothing from coffins, old shoes, bones, human bones, there are reports, and I swear to God, I am not making this up. I read this shit in a book written by a professor. Okay, so don't at me. This isn't from Reddit. This is like from a scholarly work. There were reports of people taking entire skeletons home to use as Halloween decorations. No, that is not okay. But that shit was going on. They were taking skeletons for anatomy classes, like slightly better. That's fake, by the way. Okay, this one, that's real. It's a cat. They were taking home human skeletons. Can you fucking imagine? That was somebody's body. And people would take them out of the cemetery and use them for Halloween decorations. That is some bad fucking juju. Don't do that shit. Kids would play in the cemeteries because remember, this is the 1930s. This is free range parenting, right? It's like, go play in the fucking graveyard. Come back when the lights come on. They told stories, older folks who were interviewed for this great documentary that you should watch. I'll link it in the comments. Trina Lopez, she did a documentary called Final Rest about these cemeteries. And she interviewed folks who had spent time in them when they were still technically operational. And there were stories of being children playing in the graveyards and finding things to play with. In one instance, a woman found a mummified baby in a crypt. Kids would fall into grave plots that had been dug open and get hurt and get lost. They would get stuck in tombs. They would play with the bones. It wasn't great. There's a story, my favorite story is from a man who served, he was in the army during World War II. So during World War II, I actually didn't know this until I did research on this cemeteries. They actually did blackout drills here in the city at night, right? They would black out the city, and then they would use searchlights to look for planes in the sky. And the searchlights would be mounted up there at Lone Mountain Masonic Cemetery. And so they interviewed a man who was stationed up there and was working on that. And he said it would be pitch black, right? Blackout drill, no lights, and you're in this rotten ass graveyard. He said it didn't bother him because he grew up around them. But the other soldiers who came from other parts of the country were totally freaked out. Yeah, I bet they fucking were. Especially when you hear what he said he saw one night, which was a dog running through the cemetery with the human bone in its mouth. Like a cartoon dog with like a fucking bone, like a Flintstone bone in its mouth. Human bone. Yeah, that freaked me out too. Even if I was a strapping young man in the army in 1940. Yeah, so they weren't great. They were basically becoming a nuisance. So once they become a nuisance, a public nuisance, the city is like, okay, that's it. Get rid of them. No longer just no burying them, no more burials. It's time to move these cemeteries out of town and into Colma. It was controversial at the time. The city put, the Board of Supervisors and the mayor put a ballot proposition on the ballot in 1914, asking the voters to decide, should we move the bodies or move the cemeteries? I mean, which means moving the bodies. Most of the bodies. We'll talk about that. They put it to the voters, and the voters said, no, you can't move it. So they tried again in 1921, and the voters said no. And this was like a very politically charged situation. There's a lot of interesting campaigning going on either side. It's kind of like the preservationists versus the business and residential coalitions, like the Richmond Improvement Association versus the cemeteries themselves, who don't want to have to do this, and the probably historical society folks, things like that. Read the blog post. You can click through and see all those things. It's really very interesting. There was also a lot of litigation going on. The cemeteries were suing for injunctions, saying you can't do this. And the city was saying, yes, we can. They're a nuisance. They need to be removed. And so in 1937, they put it to the voters again. And the voters finally said, yes, get them out of here. And then the litigation at the same time was wrapping up in the appellate courts, and they were finding for the city, meaning the cemeteries had to go. So that around, 1938, 1939 is when the removal process began. The removal process took a while, as you can imagine, right? Like I said, 150 acres or so. This is a lot of bodies. I actually don't have the number in front of me, but I think it had to be somewhere like 100,000 bodies. You can correct me in the comments, or we'll put the correct number up. But it's a lot of people, it's a lot of land, it's a lot of work. And, World War II is going on right now. So there's not a lot of labor available to do work like this. Some of the cemeteries did a great job and some did not. Let's talk about the good ones first. Calvary, by most accounts, did the best job. And that's because it's the church, right? It's the Catholic Church. They have the infrastructure of the diocese and the funding. They have the records to find out, next of kin, because they're all still within the church at this time. So what they did, Calvary, is they had a priest on site supervising all removals at all times. They screened the process, meaning they put up barriers around the road so that you couldn't see what they were doing. Because imagine you're just like going to get your groceries and you see people digging up a fucking cemetery, right? No, you don't want to look at that. So they screened it. They had a process where they would dig the body up. They would disinter is a nicer way of putting it. And they would transport it the same day. It would go from Calvary into a hearse to Holy Cross in Colma, buried with a priest doing the rites at Holy Cross, so that it was all, everything was done according to tradition and doctrine, so that they were kind of respectfully reinterred at Holy Cross. Laurel Hill also did a good job. They screened their work. There were a lot of important people buried at Laurel Hill. Senator David Broderick was buried there. We talked about him on some of the earlier videos. You should go watch those, because that was a trip. He died in a duel. But he was buried there. He had a large monument there. A lot of the kind of founding, important folks from town were buried there. So I think the historical societies and the preservationists were involved and watching. And they screened it. Did I say they screened it? They screened it. You'll hear why the screening is important in a minute. They moved everyone respectfully to Colma. They talked about reinterring remains in redwood boxes, because some of the remains, of course, would have been mostly decomposed, just bones at this point. But they tried to collect their items, if they had jewelry or anything they were buried with they tried to keep it together in a container, so that you were preserving the burial as much as possible. They were transported with respect down to Colma. The other thing they did, Calvary and Laurel Hill, and this is important, is they cross-checked their work. So once they did their removals, they went back and cross-checked the grid to make sure they got everyone, right? As we'll see, Masonic and Oddfellows did not do that, which leads to some fun stories for this here video series. So Oddfellows, I don't know what was going on with Oddfellows at the time, but it seemed like it was a huge mess. They didn't have money. They didn't have anyone that wanted to take it on. I don't know why. There wasn't really any reporting on why, but they did a not great job. So first of all, they did not screen the work. They did it in full view of the public. So you could be walking around, and this photo is one of my favorite photos. I use this in a lot of my posts, but this shows the workmen doing the disinterment. I mean, this was, look at it, it's a mess, right? They didn't have money for hearses or anything, so they transported the remains in a moving van, which, okay, whatever, I guess they got the job done. They were buried en masse in Colma in this kind of, right now, here's a picture of it. It's just this kind of like a weedy lot with one marker there. So it's kind of just like a mass grave site. They didn't actually open a new cemetery. And the rest of these folks went to existing cemeteries. Actually, while we're talking about it, this is the chart that shows where everyone went, from which cemeteries at Lone Mountain to where they ended up in Colma. Masonic also did not do a great job. There's not a lot of coverage that I could find about the removal process itself, but we know they didn't do a great job because they left a lot of people behind. This is like a very common refrain in San Francisco, isn't it? That's why we call it Poltergeist Town. They moved the headstones, but not the bodies. So we know that Masonic left a lot of people behind because University of San Francisco is located there now. And there are a lot of reports of USF finding remains when they did construction on the site. And the rough number that I have seen is that they found 300 bodies, around 300 bodies, and sets of remains during construction of that campus. So look, that's 300 bodies for the construction of, there were actually 2 buildings. It was a residence, or like a dorm, I think, and a science building. That's not, this cemetery was like 30 acres. Okay, 2 buildings don't take up 30 acres. So who knows what the fuck else is down there, right? Like, who knows if they removed some of them, all of them, most of them, we don't really know. They left at least 300 folks behind. And that's kind of a weird, it's kind of weird to me because it seems like the Masons are a national organization. I don't know what their chapter distribution, like what their hierarchical structure is, but it seems kind of surprising that they did such a shitty job for, I mean, the Masons. There's a lot of like kind of community leader types that are in the Masons. If you have any ideas, let me know in the comments. But I was kind of surprised by that. The Oddfellows also didn't do a spectacular job. We talked about kind of the like rough and ready disinterment they did. There are a lot of anecdotal stories about them, people living in the area now of where Oddfellow Cemetery was, finding bones in their yard. There are some stories about remains found during Rossi Park, the construction or the updates of Rossi Park. There is one really great story from 2016, which is actually very recent, of a homeowner in the area who uncovered a whole metal coffin in her yard during a home remodel. Can you fucking imagine? Okay, now for me, that would be very exciting. I don't think that this poor homeowner was expecting to find an iron casket with a glass viewing window and a little girl buried in it. This was, I think because it was iron, I think it's iron, it was some kind of metal, is why it was so well preserved, right? It was the body of a young girl, and she actually was very well preserved as well because the chemicals or the compounds from the metal mixed with the groundwater, and it actually partially embalmed or mummified her. So she was very well preserved as well. This story is crazy. So I read the local coverage. I went back and read it because, of course, at the time I was like, "Oh my God!" The press called the young girl Miranda, and it was all over the news. I mean, people were really into this story because, of course, it's so fucking weird. A whole casket. Like, you might think you might find a couple bones or some fragments of a casket, but because it was metal, it was very well preserved. She called the city, according to the San Francisco Chronicle, she called the city and said, "Okay, you got to come get this body." And the coroner told her, "No, that's your problem. You got to deal with that. That's on your property. That's your property." Really? Really? You can't just come get it? So she luckily found a nonprofit that specializes in burying and providing funerals for missing, murdered, unidentified children. So they said, "Sure, we'll help you out." And they also activated a volunteer network to kind of crowdsource finding Miranda's true identity. They used the serial number on the casket. They used DNA taken from the body, and they used forensic genealogy. And they actually found a living ancestor, and they tested him and verified who it was. And her name was Edith. And she was born in 1873. And she died of marasmus, which was a vitamin deficiency. I've had people ask me, "Oh, well, vitamin deficiency, was she poor?" And no, she wasn't poor. This was a very nice casket. The little girl was buried with a lot of accoutrement that like our accoutrement. Do you guys like my French pronunciation? Uh-huh. I don't even know if that's how you say that. I don't actually say that word out loud very often. Croissant. Anyway, she had a beautiful casket. She had lavender braided into her hair. She was buried with eucalyptus boughs. She was well dressed. I think I looked it up online, and marasmus can be caused by a bunch of different types of diseases and other problems, maybe genetic problems. She was well cared for in life. This was not a poor child who died of not getting enough food. But yeah, her name was Edith. And born in 1873. They held a new funeral for her at, I think, Cypress Lawn, and a lot of people from the public came. And it's actually the homeowner, in another interview with the Chronicle, she said that before they found Edith, they had a little ghost child in their house. It was Edith. They would hear little footsteps and giggles and sounds of children running around when there were no children in the house. And after Edith was reburied, the noises stopped. So maybe she just wanted to be found and not be under a fucking house anymore. Anyway, I thought that was a really cool, it's kind of an uplifting story at the end of this video. It's not great that she was left behind, but they were able to rebury her. And the homeowner's feeling on the matter is that she's at rest now because the ghost is gone. So there are, that's kind of like a happy ending story of some of these just really god-awful, creepy stories about construction workers finding bones everywhere in San Francisco because the people at the time who had to move cemeteries did a shitty fucking job. And they didn't care. There was probably no money for it. You know, a lot of reasons. We also talked about with City Cemetery how people were probably super traumatized at that time. That was right after the flu pandemic. You know, San Francisco, I could spend an hour talking about the problems of like wealth inequities and the lack of housing in this town, but there is nothing that won't be sacrificed for building here. Like nothing, including these cemeteries. So I hope you enjoyed that post or this video. I hope you enjoyed the post too. I hope you go read it because there's a lot of really useful and interesting information in there. Before I let you go, can we talk about my hair real quick? Because I'm noticing it and this is like, what's going on? I have curly hair. You may have seen in the other videos, it's very curly. And of course we are in the middle still of like a partial fucking lockdown. And the salons just opened up again. So I haven't been able to get my shit cut. And I tried to blow dry it yesterday because I thought, okay, well, if I blow it straight, it'll look better, right? It did not. I looked like fucking Hillary Clinton. And so I tried to like do something here, but now I just look like a rich lady's fucking dog or like maybe like a sorority sister from 2003. I don't know. It's whatever. You guys could just enjoy my ethically sourced skeletal remains on my shelf here. I hope you have a good day and thanks for listening.